We're in the information age, and really what that means it's oversaturated. Like podcasts in the rap scene, it's confusing. Whether you going live or you zooming, you ain't on the same page till you read with the wrong things, and the wrong things too many words, and every word is personal, and when it's in type, it's even worse. You misunderstood? That's just how it works. So I'm a hypocrite, just like the rest of the earth. And racists think you hate them, so they gotta hate you first. Miscegenation is a crime. The melting pot is an urn. They want us normal and ignorable, killing to burn. Sexism isn't a two-way street. Listen to her, and the slut ain't got no use as an excuse for a slur. Don't blame it on the evil. It's just people who hurt. Welcome to the Museum of Dead Words. I'm your tour guide, Dyalekt, alongside Pamela Capalla, Kristen Crouch, and Andrew J. Scoville. We spent the last 2 years pouring through conversations online to find words that kill discussions and ruin discourse. We dubbed these words dead and have been infiltrating art galleries, co-working spaces, cafes, wherever we can get in and fit in to show how these words died and why that matters. In the online series, we'll be spending a week with each word, with Blueprints in Progress on Tuesdays, that's today, where we get deep into how a word dies and why that matters. And on Thursdays, the main event is a collaboration with artists from around the world to share their experiences with these words. If you know a word or phrase that has died or may be in danger, please drop it here in the chat, send me a DM, go to Museum of Words, Dead Words, not Museum of Words, I don't know if there's a museumofwords.com, museumofdeadwords.com, and drop it in the dead word bucket so you can share it. A little bit about the museum. We opened When Your Mouth Stayed, and thanks to the generous contribution of millions of donors like you, we've been able to identify and catalog a growing list of words that have fallen into disuse. You know, in the English language, it's really hard to tell when a word stops working. Being English, these words tend to colonize conversations and then just sit there festering, letting tone and context do all the work. Sometimes these words die, and it takes generations for anybody to notice. You know, this is when words get dangerous, because words only become weapons when they cease to function as tools, and the sharpness of their wit grows in direct proportion to the dullness of their meaning. Some words are defensive, masking their lack of logic by appealing to fear. This next word is in that case. The next word that we're entering into the Museum of Dead Words is evil, an adjective and a noun that was born as an adjective around 825 and as a noun around 897. From Old English, evil, bad, vicious, ill, wicked. Funny enough, while it's definitively written as such as 825 and 897, it's probably a little bit older, if not much older, as the plural, probable plural, ilfa, Y-L-F-A, occurs in Beowulf, which is probably like 700s. So not exactly sure on the actual origins of it, but that's where it comes in print. Evil, in a general sense, is the opposite or absence of good. According to the Dictionary of Word Origins by John Ato, the original meaning of evil, it's changed a lot over the last few hundred years. And not surprisingly, theologians have had a considerable influence. Before we get into all of that stuff, and I'm actually going to be trying to divorce a little bit from a lot of the theological stuff, because that takes us in a whole nother direction and becomes another conversation. But to keep it on point here, there used to be 3 schools of thought as the types of evil there were in the world. The 3 possible forms of evil were the moral evil, commonly associated with the personal stuff, the natural evil, which is more impersonal, and that's associated with natural disasters, famine, disease, flooding, things like that. And then there's the unknowable, confusing, and oftentimes not as related to intent, metaphysical evil. That's the spiritual force that creates evil. You know what I'm saying? So they have these 3 different types, and it can denote, I really like this definition, profound immorality, but not without some basis in understanding the human condition. Like when you ask Hindus, the true roots of evil are strife and suffering, the idea of conflict and the idea of pain, which, to not go too far into another direction, a lot of folks talk about the definition of pain being weakness leaving the body, and how pain is necessary for growth and for change. And that's how we have to have conflict, because without conflict, we don't have resolution. And then everything is static, and then we don't get what we want, and people don't complain. But that's a whole nother thing. See, evil is often perceived as a dualistic, antagonistic, that's a good rhyme, dualistic, antagonistic, binary opposite to good, where good should prevail and evil should be stomped out. And that's where it gets a little bit messy, because the thing about that one is where we define good and evil create situations where there's a lot of danger. We'll get to that in a second. So, there's so many fundamental questions that are brought up by this binary, right? Like, if I can be defined as a good person, then I can rationalize my actions. Like when we talked about racism a few words back, racism was often linked to actions. In fact, the person who first coined the term racism was someone who was talking about how it was bad to kill the Indians, the Native Americans, and instead they said to kill the Indian but save the man. So they didn't want to kill them physically. They were like, no, let's kill their culture and the things about them. Like racism, evil tends to be about intent to people. And what's interesting about it is in later times, in the past 10 years, it's had a big influence over the way we share our media. And TV shows have been really huge, like things like Mad Men, Breaking Bad, BoJack Horseman, really huge TV shows of this era talk a lot about, if I define myself as a good person on the inside, if I feel like I'm good in here, does that justify, does that rationalize the bad actions that I've done, the harmful actions that I've done, the hurt that I've caused, the pain that I've caused, the death that I've caused? So what meaning is it for hurt? Are these things necessary for growth, or are these things the byproduct of evil? The definition or the division between those two definitely comes to headcanon, as we talked about with sexism. If you can rationalize these things that we create, again, our imaginations don't just break us out of boxes, they also create the boxes that we live in. The headcanon about people being good or our institution being good, therefore actions that are not necessarily good or become necessary, become usable because of the things that we had the doorbell ring and messed me up. Okay, become okay because of the people that we have to take down. Just like when Sophie was putting up her posters in Mexico, where it was illegal to take down posters that were in support of a political cause, the police took them down because they felt that their institution is correct, therefore she's wrong. Even though there was no intent that was evil, there was no action that was evil. In fact, as we talk about the word evil and people bring it and tie it to intent, remember that we already have a great word for evil intent, and that's malice. Carl Jung, in his book Answer to Job, he depicted evil as the dark side of the Christian God, because he's talking about Job, the guy who was put upon by God in the Christian Bible. And he said that people tend to believe evil is something external to them because they tend to project their shadow onto others. He interpreted the story of Jesus as an account of God facing his own shadow. And while there's a lot of fruitful, really interesting religious stuff to reach into, it makes me think about when Clara was talking about hypocrite and the duality of people, saying that there is good and evil within us, dark and light within us. And when we talk about these binaries and darkness, evil is always associated with dark, which is associated with ignorance, fear, lack of knowing, and is also associated with having an excuse to hurt folks. There are many people in the Christian faith who think that Black people are immoral because of the story of Ham, saying that they have been cursed. Evil is often also related with curses, not to get too much into the metaphysical versions. To talk about all of these religious, metaphysical, supernatural relations to the word evil, we have to dig into those connections, because it looks like there's a lot of connection. Devil, evil, good, God, Eve, evil. I did a little bit of digging to check out like if Eve had anything to do with evil, because you know how we feel about women out in this world today. We just talked about that with sexism and with last week's word slut. And so evil comes from old Germanic sources mostly, and the name Eve is derived from Hebrew, so they don't even come from the same places. And evil and devil actually doesn't come from the same thing either. So devil comes from a Greek word, diablos, which you might have heard. It's a fun one sounding. It means liar or slanderer. It's actually a combination of dia, a cross, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing this terribly, balin or baleen, which is to throw. See, that's what's called an orthographic resemblance, or that's just a fancy way of me saying that. It's spelled similarly, so people tend to make these kind of connections. In a couple of weeks, when we're talking about patterns, we'll talk about how these orthographic connections often lead people to creating patterns that don't actually exist. One of them, I'll bring up, I found this when I was digging in Merriam-Webster, and there's a lot of words surrounding evil that have been co-opted into the fray, basically to justify somebody's perspective. One of these is sinister. Do you know that sinister, it means evil, malevolent, often dealing with intent, even more so than actions? There's this idea, when I say sinister, as a sneer, a smile, a knowingness that other folks don't have. Don't know sinister just means on the left. Similarly, dexterous comes from the Latin word for right, dexter. One of the things that people have thought is that the reasoning has to do with the majority of folks are right-handed. So left-handed people are exotic, scary, unknowable, dark. I forget how I've already talked about this, and tell me in the chat if we've already discussed this one, but another word's origin, villain. Villain comes from medieval English, and the original word is villa or villager, meaning poor person. And the original etymology of it meant that a poor person is lazy, and then that was conflated from a poor person being lazy to a lazy poor person, then being violent, to then that being the biggest, most widely used, most widely accepted word for someone who is evil. To make another connection, there's an Indo-European word, upelo, meaning exceeding proper bounds, or even uppity. In Old English, evil was pretty bland, pretty non-explosive. It meant someone who was exceeding their bounds, someone who was uppity. I don't know if you remember a group of people who have been described historically in the United States as being uppity, but they often tend to be at least descendants of villagers, people who are considered sinister, people who are confusing, people who speak differently, people who are darker, people who can't be comprehended. They often love sticking words in front of evil to try to make it sound even scarier. Unspeakable evil, incomprehensible evil. Evil in horror movies often has no origin or confusing origins. All of this tends to be fairly modern, and there's a great research, I think, even better than the work that we've done here at the museum. All great research is picking on the backs of great research. Feel free to continue to research on the backs of things, even if smarter people done some digging. There's more digging to do. In Evil in Modern Thought from 2002, writer Susan Neiman, she traced the philosophy struggles with evil over several hundred years. Now, she talks about how there are two events in history that are the central poles of the modern era of the understanding of evil, and they are Lisbon and Auschwitz. In 1755, at the dawn of the Enlightenment, there was an earthquake that destroyed Lisbon. That's one of the big cities in Europe. And, before this disaster was when we talked about the three types of evil being your moral evil, your natural evil, and your supernatural evil. I think I said metaphysical, but same kind of difference. This concept of evil, again, dominated by theological thought, which attempted to reconcile the idea that good deities would allow bad things to happen. Apparently, the destruction of Lisbon was so vast and random and kind of meaningless that it shook people's faith in the idea that evil could be something natural. So the concept of evil began falling apart. And this is where those ideas of malice and intent started getting in there. And then there was another large event that really solidified the idea of evil. And that one, I feel like, we've come back to this one a lot in these discussions, but it's been a large part of what's been going on in our few generations. And when she says Auschwitz, she just doesn't mean Auschwitz itself, but the writer is talking about the time in World War II with Nazis and all the good stuff that we're dealing with. So a great quote from Susan here says, precisely the belief that evil actions require evil intentions allow totalitarian regimes to have functions. They are allowed to override moral objections that might otherwise have functions. Heinous acts are all too easily rationalized by loyalty to supposedly higher values. Calling something evil, she wrote, is a way of marking the fact that it shatters our trust in the world. Evil is both harmful and inexplicable, but not just that. What defines evil is an act that is so permanently disorienting for all that touch it. It's one of the amazing and powerful things about the word evil, is that it is permanently disorienting and it confuses our perspective. It often leads to a state of nihilism, the concept of the evil that men do. When we look at, I'm a big fan of horror movies, and what I love horror movies about monsters are always about how the actual evil is not the scary monster. The scary monster is like that old definition of evil, acting within nature. And the true evil is in the intent of men. That evil requires agency, that you can't be born with it. This all pulls me back to the idea again that evil is some sort of adversary. That if people are evil, they're unlike us. They not only wear the opposite jersey, but they're completely different because we lack recognizable evil and are therefore good. Remember that misnomer I was talking about before. So if they, the opposite of us, are evil, they are our adversary, our antagonist. And if y'all remember the definition of antagonist, an antagonist in the story is just a person trying to stop the protagonist, not necessarily a bad person or even a wrong person. But if someone is an adversary, is an antagonist, is wrong, is sinister, is left-handed, shaking left-handed, using left-handed cigarettes, acting underhanded, then you can stop them, imprison them, hurt them, and kill them. What's amazing is a lot of folks who are listening to this right now be like, hey, I'm really progressive. I believe in all people's beauty inside, and we've all got our great stuff, and I care about the world. Think about how many people you've seen on the internet or even in personal life that are strictly and staunchly against mass incarceration. But when somebody they can't stand, possibly a rapist or a murderer, someone who's racist, someone who's done something that is definitively horrible, is imprisoned, immediately the rape jokes come, even though those are the same types of horrible actions that we're worried about. These things come down to a psychological condition called system justification theory, that people desire not only to hold favorable attributes about themselves, but also the situation and the social structure that they're entwined in, and they find themselves obligated to be. The system justifying motive sometimes produces a phenomenon known as outgroup favoritism and acceptance of inferiority amongst low status groups and a positive image of relatively high status groups. That's like when folks tell you that poor people who are in their community or people like them, I've even heard folks in the Black community say, you can't trust other Black folks in the businesses they do, even though the reason that those businesses are not doing well is because they don't come from as much capital and oftentimes have been firebombed into oblivion. Additionally, the passive ease of supporting the current structure when compared to potential price, the material, social, psychological of acting out against the status quo, that leads to a shared environment in which the existing social, economic, and political arrangements tend to be preferred. Alternatives to the status quo tend to be disparaged, and inequality tends to perpetuate. In other words, when we live in a system where it is illegal for you to learn to read, other folks will teach you not to read, because if you do, you will get shot. In a place where you are told that if there is insurrection, if there is revolution, if there is a change in the status quo, you will be shot, then people will tell you to keep your mouth shut before you get shot. In other words, we will create this box using our headcanon to justify the status quo, which will allow people to harm us, all because we have the fear of imaginary evil. This evil that comes from some sort of intent or some sort of action. While digging through in our research, y'all, I found a really powerful quote from a Victor Volkov, someone from Quora, where they have a conversation about these things. And I think he summed up better than I could. And I want to finish with this. I believe there's no good and no evil. Evil is born when someone judges the actions of another. People call evil those who oppose them, and they call good those who help them. Essentially, that's all there is to it. People want different things, have different interests. Even those whose interests they're clashed, people get hurt and sometimes die. In general, the human system of morality has no other purpose other to ensure that society does not self-destruct. Do not kill, do not steal, etc. at all. If you think about it, you realize that essential actions that are the condemned acts are those that people would make if they're afraid and refuse to cooperate with each other. Meaning, these are self-defense mechanisms. With all that in mind, the ideas of good and evil are extreme oversimplifications. Evil is someone who needs to be destroyed, or it is something people shouldn't be doing. Otherwise, society would be in danger. Again, when we take apart the meanings of evil, and we take apart the intent and our actions, we remember that the things that hurt us, the things that are for us, are always the things that are for other people. And remembering that there is an idea, or not remembering that, creating the idea that there is an evil, and that those who oppose us, those who are against us, those who think we're wrong are evil, creates justification for us to create the thing that we would call evil to them. So that's what we have today on evil. Join us on Thursday, where we're going to be rocking with Alkestis, and I'll check you guys next time on the Museum of Dead Words. Peace.